So what's the current state of CSS3? Where are we at these days?
Well, the fantastic thing is we're starting to have broad browser support for it. The top version of all the major browsers has really pretty good CSS3 support, and so we can actually start using it. We still need to think about fallbacks, but it's like a legitimate thing that can be used these days.
That's good.
Yeah,
that's progress.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. Now, you had a blog post where you talked about some of the CSS best practices that everybody's using are actually harmful. How is that working? I mean, what are there specific ones that people just shouldn't be doing?
Yeah, it was quite a revelation for me. For a long time, I realized that we were ending up with bad outcomes, but I wasn't exactly sure why. And I could see a few different things which were kind of contributing to it, but it took about 6 months of sort of mulling the issue over to realize that our best practices were actually causing these bad outcomes. The single worst is location-dependent styles. So CSS is really easy to say when you're inside this and inside this and inside this, make it look like that. But the trouble is you've made something which could be reusable, but because you specified exactly where in the DOM hierarchy it needs to be in order to function, it won't function anywhere else. So I would say that kind of duplication is the single worst thing you can do.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what are the major browser issues we're facing right now with CSS3?
It's actually getting pretty good. I mean, there's always the how to fall back to the old versions of IE because for most big companies, it's just not realistic to, and frankly not, not universal design and all that to just ignore a whole section of users. And for a big company, it can be millions of people who are still on IE6, particularly if you have a lot of users in Japan or parts of Korea or China. So I think that the browser support is good, but we still have to think about those fallbacks and design so that it's okay if it falls back. What if the corners are square in IE? If they're all square, that user won't ever know because it's not like anybody besides developers is opening it in 5 different browsers and comparing it, saying that rounded corner is not exactly the same.
Really? That's not common?
Well, among our people it is, right? But,
sure. No, that makes sense. Can you explain a little bit the relationship as you see it between CSS3, HTML5, and site speed? How do those things come together?
Well, a lot of people would really like it if CSS and HTML performance issues were like, find the exact little tiny problem and pluck it out, and then everything will be fine. Sure. Like, some sort of tumor or something. And if they could just find the selector that had caused their performance issues, everything would be fine. Unfortunately, it's not really like that. It's more about how much you've written, how efficiently you're reusing things. And I think the single most interesting thing, particularly for CSS3, is the ability to get rid of images. If you look at Steve's tool, HTTP Archive, you'll see that across the board, images contribute a huge amount to the overall weight of the page. And while Stoyan and I did a tool a few years ago to smush those images and get the last little bytes out that you can to make them as small as possible, we can now consider actually eliminating them completely via CSS gradients and shadows and inset shadows and combinations of all of the above.
Yeah. I imagine removing them wholesale is the single best optimization.
It absolutely is. You lose weight, you lose HTTP requests. Yeah, it's kind of, CSS3 right now is a brand new playground because we have all these things which are now possible to use, which weren't before. A year ago, I wouldn't have said to use them.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Interesting. How about on the mobile side? So what are the issues that developers are facing in the mobile space with HTML5 and CSS right now?
I think the single biggest issue is the fragmentation. There are so many different versions of different browsers with subtly different levels of support. It can be quite complicated to get that working. I'd say in iOS, not having position fixed means that web-based apps are not as viable as native apps because you can't do fixed top and bottom menus without a whole lot of JavaScript and some funky stuff. So that iOS, I believe, has decided to implement that in their next version is fantastic. That makes it a much more viable option.
So last question I have for you, and it's a little bit further afield of all of this stuff, but Over your career in CSS, what's your favorite hack?
Oh,
or what's
hard
caught
if you
your
say
attention now?
yeah. If you say over my career, there are a million of them. But right now, there's a girl named Leah Veru who has done some amazing stuff that you wouldn't believe was possible with CSS gradients. Mm-hmm. She does patterns, she does stripes, she does square boxes, she does something that looks like patterns of Chrome and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. And I wouldn't have even thought to take CSS gradients to that level because it doesn't look anything like a gradient. Mm-hmm. She's basically making images out of gradients, and the possibilities for eliminating background images with that are fantastic.
And it's all just CSS.
It is, yeah. The one thing is if you get the really complex ones, like she's made plaid out of CSS gradients, it ends up being fairly large, right?
Sure, right.
You lose the HTTP request, but the image is probably about the same size as the amount you'd add to the CSS.
Sure, a trade-off, absolutely. Yeah, well, thanks so much for being with us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.